Okay, so we just went over the customer module, and next we're going to go into the quotes module. And I do just want to take a moment to mention that in our system, we refer to quotes and parts interchangeably. That is because our quote module stores the pricing information as well as the specification needed to run the part. Typically what would happen is someone, the estimator, would go in and create a new part, a new quote, with a minimum amount of information needed to come up with a price. They'd send the price out to the customer. Once the customer gives approval and sends in the work, someone would go back and fill in the part with additional information as needed in order to run the part successfully. And we do have some checks in the system to help you track those steps, which we'll go over once we actually go into a part. But I do just want to talk a little bit about the part lookup screen, which we're in now. You can see that it is very similar to the customer lookup screen where we have our quick search by, set filter, print list, change history, just as we did in the customer. One new addition is we have this part preview down here where you can see pictures that have been attached to the part. In this case, some masking pictures have been attached to it. These pictures can be useful for looking up parts if we have multiple parts with the same part number that may belong to different companies, or maybe even the same part number for the same company but different revisions. So if we need to look up by quote number, part number, company, we can do that. We can also use the set filter. So let's say I want to see just parts for a particular company. I can do that. And last time we only talked about filtering by one condition, but I do want to show that we can filter by more than one. Under this and or, we can specify if we want the part to meet both conditions or either condition. So in this case, I only want to look at parts that meet both conditions. So I'm going to filter by company and by spec. We'll go ahead and apply that. And you can see that we have some parts there. Now, if this is a filter that we're going to use a lot, we can actually save it to make it easier to access in the future. So I could say, Benson zinc parts. I can save that, and then if the future, if I wanted to recall it, I can just select it from the list, and we're right back to where we were.
Very good. That's a nice feature.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with the print list again, we can create a quick listing of parts. So if I'm just going to uncheck some information so that we don't have a very tight print list. If I preview this, you can see that we can create our own part listing report. Now, the system does come with a built-in part listing report, but this can be useful if there's custom information that you want to include on the report. And again, in addition to creating your own report, you can do data view and export. So let's say that you want to do a price evaluation on parts for this customer. You can actually export to Excel, open up the file, and then you can either do sum, averages, VLOOKUP, whatever you need to do in order to evaluate the pricing information for these parts. You can see you have all this information available. Okay?
Yeah.
All right. And I do also want to touch upon the change history feature again with this part, which actually has some history. You can see, unlike the customer we went over, there's multiple history records here. The white records are historical records, records that existed in the past, whereas the green one is the one that exists in the system now, as indicated by our color coding. And you can see the changes, like here, we used to have this price and the price has changed. And you can actually see which user is associated with that change as well. So this was changed by user T on today's date.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Very good. Yeah.
So again, this is just a useful feature for auditing purposes. Right. So now I'm going to go ahead and create a new part, and I'm going to do that by actually, unlike in the customer module, here when you're creating a new part, you're given the option to copy. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So the copying could be useful if you have a part that runs a similar process, or if it's similar dimensions, where you want to copy as much information as possible so you don't have to enter as much. So you can see all the information came in, and if I needed to change the customer, if this was a part for a different customer, I could do that. Or let's say in this case that this is the same part for the same customer, but a customer has asked for some changes to how it's run. We could actually just say that this is a different revision, so it could be revision B of this part. That way we can store the history of the first revision if we need to run it again, but we also have the new information as well. So we have company part number, which is the customer's part number. We have the description. Quote number is a unique ID generated by the system, whereas estimate number is used when printing the quote. So if a customer asks you to quote multiple parts, you can assign all of those parts the same estimate number so they print out on the same quote together. By default, the system will assign each part the same estimate number as its quote number, so essentially each part will print on its own quote. If you want them to print together, all you have to do is change them all to have the same estimate number. This is the customer RFQ number, which you can enter if the customer provided you with one. We have the date initialized of the part. We can set the part to inactive, which is a useful feature if you have a part that hasn't been run in a few years, but you want to keep its information in case the customer comes back, or you just want to review the history of that part. You can mark it inactive so it can't be created as a job order. We also have the process, which is the main means by specifying the instructions for the shop floor users. We'll go into that in more depth when we get to the process tab, but I do just want to mention that it is visible here from the main tab, so you can get a quick view of which process it's using. We have specifications, which is an unlimited typable area. And I do just want to quickly point out that this supports rich text. What that means is that you can do things like change color. If you want to make it stand out more, you can increase size, and you can do your own fonts, bold, italicize, whatever you need to do. And it doesn't have to be the whole thing. I mean, I could, have a, large text and, start typing, and change it. So you can highlight different information, and it's all about how you want to present it. Now, down here, we have a lot of different information about the part. The important thing is that you don't have to enter in all of this information, especially if you're in the quoting phase. You just have to enter in a minimum amount of information to come up with a good price. If you do want to track some of this information, you can certainly enter it, and it'll print out on the job ticket. But again, if you don't need to enter in every single little bit of detail in order for this to come up with a good price. Speaking of pricing, I do want to touch on the Excel worksheet. So we've found that many companies have their own proprietary methods of coming up with a price. What the Excel worksheet allows you to do is create those formulas and associate them with the part so they can be auto-calculated based on information that's entered in the part. So you can see that we already have which copied from the existing part, so we didn't have to re-enter it all. We already have a calculation where it's using the pieces per load, which is entered here, as well as the load per hour, to come up with a minimum price. So the way I'll go ahead and open it so that we can look at the formulas. But the way our calculation is working is we say, okay, the minimum cost to run this line is $45 an hour. So we figure out how many pieces we can run per hour based on the load size and the loads per hour, and come up with the minimum price we have to charge per part in order to meet our operating costs. Then we have an adjustment factor, which is essentially a markup, to come up with our price. Now again, this is Excel, so you can create whatever calculations you need. That's the advantage of it. And you can see that we pulled the information right from this record data tab. So the record data has information about the part that's entered by the user. So we have all this information that's available for you to use in your calculations. this operating cost, you can see that it's not a calculation. You just entered in the number. So if over time your operating costs change, you can change it and the calculation will reflect that change. Also, if you want to do a larger markup on some parts, maybe because the minimum price is so small, you can certainly make any sort of adjustment you need.
Fantastic. Yeah, very good.
Now, you can see that once the new price has been generated, we have here, it's being set in this column, and this column is actually a new value. So what the system will do is if you calculate a price and it copies it from sheet 1, it'll actually write that price back to the part file. So this isn't just for reference, it can also update the price directly. So it's very useful that way. So I'm actually going to leave this alone and I'll exit. And you'll see that our price information has updated to the new 1.98 amount. And of course, we could have also had calculations that set the different prices down here. And what these are different prices based on quantity. So if you want to do price breaks for large quantity job orders, you can certainly offer that. Since we only calculated the first price, these prices have not been updated. So either we'd want to go back to the Excel and have those prices also updated with whatever discount we're offering, or we can just kind of manually figure it out at this point too. So, let's say, small discount for larger quantities.
So just to clarify, this is for quantity lot discount pricing structure. Is that correct?
Correct. So in this case, if we have a job that's between 1,000 and 5,000 pieces, then this is the price that would be used by the system. And all of this information prints out on the quote so that the customer that you're quoting knows the pricing options available.
Mm-hmm. Now, does it support minimum lot charge?
Yes, it does. So up here is the minimum price, and we also see the minimum lot charge. So let's say that you never want to run this job for less than $150. If you enter in the minimum lot charge, the system will calculate if the expected invoice amount of the job will exceed the minimum lot charge. If it does not, then it will charge a lot charge of $150.
And what about, I see the additional charges section here on the screen. Can you talk a little bit more about it?
Sure. So we find that there are times when you have charges that are not related directly to part processing. In this case, we have an environmental charge, which is a $5 charge. You could have tooling, shipping charges. You might have some kind of additional surcharge. Now, the additional charges feature is very powerful in that it lets you have all sorts of different ways of controlling how it's billed. In this case, you can see that the environmental charge is billed for each shipping order, but we have several different frequencies. So you could have a charge that's only billed once, like maybe a setup fee or a tooling charge. You could have charges that are only billed once per job order. So even if the job order ships in multiple partial shipments, that charge will only be associated with the first instance of that job. You can also have a charge that's only billed once per invoice. So if you have a customer that you're invoicing multiple jobs at the same time, it will not add the charge per job order, only add it once for the entire invoice. Now in this case, we have a fixed charge, but you also have the option of doing a percentage. So you could say that this is 5% of the invoice total.
And is there a limit to how many charges you can have per quote or per part?
No, you can have as many charges as you'd like.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to add more, you can just hit the plus button. You can specify the charge, and then the condition and frequency. So if you don't specify a frequency, it defaults to SO, which is with each shipping order.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I want to go back to the main tab now that we've talked a little bit about pricing. So you can see that we actually use this information about the part to come up with our price. That depends on which Excel calculation you use. In our case, we use pieces per load per hour. Now down here, you can see that we have engineering approved by and QC approved by. This is that check I talked about regarding differentiating which parts have been quoted and which ones have been filled in the specification. So when you initially quote, you would not fill this information in. When the customer gives you the approval to go forward with running the job, someone would have to go back to the quote, go through, assign the correct information, and then they'd approve it. If the engineering and QC approved is not checked off, it prints in really bold and noticeable letters on the job traveler so that the users on the shop floor know that it has not been properly spec'd out. So that is how you control that in the shop.
That is a nice quality control and process management feature that you have here in the system.
Okay.
For quoting, I see that you have the turnaround days and production days. Could you please elaborate a little bit on those fields?
Sure. So in the job order, the system has a default date required, which can be specified to whatever default turnaround time you want. We find most customers use 7 days. But you can also specify a different amount on a per customer or per part basis. So let's say that for this part you can run it quicker, so you turn the turnaround days to say 3. Or if it takes longer, you could say 10. And now those turnaround days may or may not include weekends, depends on what your settings are in the module. Production days, unlike turnaround days, is for scheduling purposes. So if you know that it takes 10 days to turn around a part, but it only takes 5 days to run, then the production days tells you the minimum amount of days you need to start the job in order to get it to its desired shipping date. Okay.
I'll have to cut